The old man climbed the steps of the gymnasium as if he were climbing an invisible mountain. One step at a time, his hand gripped the railing tightly, his body bent by time and war. He wore no medals on display, no uniform. Just a faded army cap, a simple jacket, and a pair of Jordan 1 sneakers, old and rare, with frayed stitching and faded leather, but incredibly well cared for. Those sneakers had seen the world change more than once. His name was Bob Gaines, 92 years old. A former officer in the U.S. Army, but that night, no one knew that. He wasn't in the VIP stands. He was up there in the crowd, sitting in a forgotten corner of the gym, watching. The court was ablaze with lights. The charity event brought together athletes, influencers, sponsors, and of course, him, Michael Jordan, the star of the night. Everyone was looking at him, except Bob. He was looking at his feet, his own feet. As the flashbulbs lit up celebrities, Bob remained in the shadows. His sneakers, dirty on the sides and cracked on the soles, caught the attention of a group of young people. They laughed, pointed, and whispered to each other. "Look at that, bro! A museum-quality Jordan!" Bob listened, but he didn't react. He did what he always did. He took a deep breath, lowered his eyes, and remained silent. After all, this was common. He had faced worse enemies in the past, and not all of them wore uniforms. At one point, a security guard in a dark suit approached. He looked Bob up and down. "Sir, this space is reserved. You'll need to step aside, okay?" There was no argument. Bob just nodded, struggled to his feet, and walked to the side of the gym. Then something strange happened. With each step he took, his sneakers made a subtle creaking sound. Almost imperceptible. But to Bob, the sound carried memories. It was as if each crack of the old sole echoed voices from the past. Of crying boys, of wounded comrades, of forgotten promises. As he walked away, one of the young men took a photo of him from behind. The caption was straightforward. "Old man trying to show off with fake Jordan. LOL." The post went viral in seconds, but what no one knew, not the security guard, not the young people, not even the public, was that those sneakers weren't just original. They held a story, one that couldn't fit into a social media post, one that began more than 50 years ago, amid the chaos of a military parade. Bob had received those sneakers from a lost boy with frightened eyes and trembling hands, whom he had protected with his own body until his father was found. The boy, before leaving, said softly, "One day, I will be someone, and I will remember you." Bob smiled at that memory as if he were holding a precious secret. Because in that gym, amidst the screams, applause, and cameras, no one had any idea who he really was, and, much less, who he had helped. Have you ever been judged just by your appearance? Have you ever felt like no one sees who you really are? Then stay with me until the end of this story. Because what happens next will make you believe that life always finds a way to recognize those who deserve it. And when Michael Jordan's eyes finally meet that old man's, something unexpected will happen. Something that neither the crowd nor the press, and certainly not those who mocked him, could ever have imagined. But before that, there was still a long silence to be broken, and memories that needed to be awakened. He leaned against the wall as if seeking shelter from an invisible storm. The crowd pulsed around him, shouts, horns, flashbulbs. But to Bob, it all sounded distant, muffled as in an old dream. The lights of the gym seemed too much for his tired eyes, and the smell of sweat and expensive perfume didn't match the dust and motor oil he carried in his memory. Yet there he was, standing alone, his eyes fixed on what he could see of the court between the columns and heads in front of him. Two young men were laughing on the opposite side. One of them pulled out his cell phone with the naturalness of someone who had never had to hide his fear of bombs. He pointed discreetly and took a photo. The laughter came soon after, like a slap. "Look at the old man trying to be stylish with a museum Jordan. He must have found it in the trash." The caption appeared seconds later on social media. "I found the new senior influencer." The post was shared, commented on, and liked in record time. Bob heard it. You didn't have to see it. The tone was always the same. The faces, the years, the context changed. But the sound of the mockery was the same as the one he heard at 22 when he came back from the war and was called a murderer by strangers on the street. The same as the one he heard when he tried to enlist for a new mission and was told he was too old. The same as the one you heard when you walked into a store the other day and the clerk didn't even bother to look at you. Bob's heart wasn't broken by this anymore. It had been broken for decades. And yet it hurt. It was a pain that didn't bleed, but burned inside. The pain of being discarded while still breathing. Of being treated like an object from another time. Of knowing that if today there was freedom for these young people to mock, it was because men like him accepted the weight of responsibility when no one else wanted to carry it. But Bob didn't answer. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't even look away. Because he knew something those young people didn't. Something that no flash, meme, or like could erase. Those sneakers on my feet weren't just shoes. They were part of a promise. And if he was there, even if it was in the dark, even if he was pushed into a corner, it was because something inside him was telling him that that day wasn't just another one. An old memory began to knock on the door of memory. It was a hot summer day. A crowd filled a Chicago street during a military parade. Amid the drums and flags, a little boy had lost his father. He was alone, crying, his hands over his face. Bob found him behind a platform, huddled and shaking. She sat down next to him, with the calm of someone who has seen worse things. She didn't ask his name. She just told him a story about courage. She talked about fear, about breathing, about waiting even when everything around her seems to be falling apart. When we take a deep breath, the fear doesn't go away, but we gain space to continue standing. The boy stopped crying, and when his father finally appeared, grateful and in tears, he gave the soldier a gift, a pair of sneakers, still smelling new. He said, "My son will thank you one day, when he's a big guy." Bob didn't take it seriously. But he kept it. And now, decades later, there he was, with the same sneakers, with the same silence, and with the same hope, small, almost forgotten, but alive, that perhaps that boy had remembered. The voices around him began to rise. It was a sign that someone important was entering the academy. Bob didn't turn around immediately, but he felt it. The environment has changed. Something was about to happen. Because the truth is that no one there had any idea of the impact that old man would have that night. The steps came rhythmically, steadily, almost choreographed. The kind of sound that the crowd recognizes without having to look when the big star finally enters the scene. It was him, Michael Jordan. The living legend of basketball, the symbol of an era, the name that became a brand, a myth, and an inspiration in the same breath. The commotion was instantaneous. People stood up, cell phones were in the air, voices were raised in euphoria. The atmosphere in the gym changed as if a storm had broken through the ceiling. Bob kept his eyes down. He pretended he didn't see. He pretended he didn't feel. But inside, his chest tightened as if someone had pulled the loose threads of time and tied them around his heart. He heard the screams, the applause, the security guards clearing the way. And yet, none of it was for him. Not tonight. Jordan passed by a few meters away. His suit was well cut. He walked confidently, his expression armored. He didn't look to the sides, or back. His eyes were on the goal, the court. Bob, for his part, leaning against the wall, shrank back a little more, not out of fear, but out of a kind of silent shame that only the forgetful know, that embarrassment of occupying a space that no longer seems to be yours. It was at that moment that a boy ran by and bumped into Bob's shoulder without apologizing. The impact was slight, but enough to make him lose his balance and fall into a sitting position, his knees stiff as he tried to cushion his fall. His left hand hit the ground, the cracked and thin palm tearing a little more. It bled slowly. Nobody saw. Nobody stopped. A sneaker came loose from the toe, opening the soul like a fish tired of breathing. And still, Bob didn't try to get up right away. He stayed there for a few seconds, his body on the ground, his eyes on the sneaker. A tear in the rubber, another in his soul. He remembered when he had to hold back his tears after losing his best friend in Afghanistan, when he returned to base alone with his best friend's boots slung over his shoulder. At the time, they called him a hero, but no one accompanied him to the funeral. No one paid for those tears. And now, years later, he was bleeding again. Inside. Without an audience, without flags. Only with the weight of silence. He stood up slowly. A young event worker saw him with a scraped knee and ran over to him. "Sir, are you okay? Did you hurt yourself?" Bob just nodded. He hid his injured hand in his coat pocket. He didn't want any mercy. He'd survived ambushes, landmines, and melees before. What was a fall in a gym compared to all this? But the real answer is that it hurt. In a different way. Because no one there knew what he was carrying in his pocket. There, folded neatly inside an old handkerchief, was a piece of aged paper. Yellowed at the edges, folded so many times it had nearly come apart. It was a handwritten note, years ago. The tiny, shaky letters of a child still learning to write. "Thank you for protecting me. When I'm famous, I'll come back to find you. MJ." Yes, MJ. The initials were there. He kept it like someone who keeps a secret that not even he knows if it's still real. An old dream or a forgotten promise. Bob never told this story to anyone. Not his children. Not his wife, who had already left years before. Maybe he was afraid of looking crazy. Or maybe he was protecting the last spark of something he really wanted to believe was still true. But time tires. It corrodes. And while Jordan laughed with his teammates on the court, Bob discreetly wiped the blood from his knee with the lining of his jacket. The clerk offered him a better chair. He declined. He said it was fine. And he walked away once more. But something changed. Michael Jordan, on the other side, paused for a moment. His gaze was distant, almost lost in the middle of another athlete's speech. He blinked twice. He frowned. Then he looked again. It seemed like I saw something. A sneaker or a souvenir? Write in the comments. There are stories that not even time can erase, because the truth is that certain connections, no matter how silent they are, one day scream. And when they scream, someone listens. Bob stood still. He didn't even blink. As Jordan walked by, surrounded by flashbulbs and backslapping, he had the strange sensation that time was moving in slow motion. But not for him. As if the world were moving too fast around someone who was stuck in yesterday. His torn sneaker still hurt, his knee burned, and the paper in his pocket seemed to weigh more than before. But what really hurt was not being seen. Michael continued on his way without looking away, as if the old man leaning against the wall was just part of the decor. And maybe he was. For many, an old man standing upright is nothing more than a worn-out post, a forgotten piece of furniture. Except that Bob wasn't a piece of furniture. He was the foundation of stories that no one tells anymore. The silent foundation of achievements that are now celebrated by those born in times of peace. The silence that followed that passage was louder than the noise of the crowd, more cruel than the laughter of the young people. Bob looked at his feet and for a moment thought about leaving, going down the same steps he had climbed, ignored, hurt, emptied. His dignity held on, but he trembled inside. And in this silent conflict between enduring and giving up, he remembered something he had heard as a boy, before the war. Those who live invisible learn to recognize the false glow of the spotlight. He didn't want light. He wanted to be remembered. And that was different. He sat back down with difficulty, away from the crowd, like a spectator of the show he had helped create, but had never been invited to go on stage. He crossed his arms, adjusted his coat, and closed his eyes for a moment, trying not to feel. But the smell of the place, the energy in the air, all of it brought back memories, good and bad. like the time he was retired and went to hand in his resume at an auto parts store. The manager looked him up and down and said that they only hired people with energy. Bob smiled, thanked him, and left. The next day, he saw a boy wearing flip-flops and headphones at the same counter. The pain wasn't because he hadn't gotten the job. It was because he knew his story was worthless in a world of quick faces and forgotten names. There, in that gym, everything seemed to repeat this cycle. He, once again, was on the outside, watching, enduring, bleeding inside without letting anyone see. But there was something that broke the pattern. It was subtle, a quick gesture, a glance. Jordan, already on the sidelines, paused for a second. His eyes, covered by his sunglasses, seemed to hesitate. He turned his head slightly. Too small to attract attention. Big enough for Bob to notice, it was like a streak of hope piercing the darkness. But it didn't last long. Jordan was soon pulled away by the team, surrounded by hugs and greetings. The doubt, if there was any, hung in the air. Still, Bob felt it. Something had been triggered. A memory, perhaps. A noise from the past breaking through the barriers of the present. A crack in that routine of indifference. He reached into his coat pocket and, with steady fingers, touched the paper. It was still there. The note. The simple words of a scared boy that he had protected with everything he had. He didn't need to read them again. Each letter was etched in his mind, like a scar that would not fade. When I'm famous, I'll come back to find you. It will be. The doubt hurt more than his injured knee. And once again, he asked himself, had it just been childish kindness, a phrase thrown to the wind? Or had that boy really become the man who now smiled for the cameras, oblivious to his surroundings? While he was thinking, a photographer approached. He wanted to take pictures of the spontaneous audience. When he pointed the lens at Bob, the look of contempt was clear. He lowered the camera and walked away, as if to say with the gesture, "It won't get any likes." Bob shifted in his chair. His hand was shaking now, holding the paper. He didn't know if he should stay there. But something deep, almost sacred, told him to stay. Because certain promises are not forgotten. They just fall asleep. And when they wake up, the world around them is never the same again. Write in the comments. There are some things that time cannot erase. Because even if everything around us insists on moving forward, there are encounters that destiny refuses to let pass. Bob didn't answer right away. The officer's question hung in the air like a breeze in anticipation of a storm. He looked the boy in the eye, and for a second, he considered lying, saying any name, avoiding the exposure, the embarrassment, the risk of looking like a confused old man trying to get attention. But something inside him, perhaps the same sense of duty that had driven him to protect lives on the battlefield, took over. His name was Michael. Michael Jordan. It was barely a whisper, but enough to make the employee choke on his own air. Before Bob could explain, a movement behind him changed the mood. Firm, quick footsteps coming from the direction of the dressing rooms. One of Jordan's security guards stopped a few feet away, his gaze intent. And behind him, emerging from the crowd of onlookers and staff, was Michael Jordan. Without his sunglasses. Without his usual automatic smile. With his gaze fixed. He didn't say anything right away. He just stared. First at Bob's face, then at his sneakers, and then back at his face, like he was trying to fit together pieces of an ancient puzzle he hadn't even realized he still had. Bob didn't move. He didn't even breathe properly. The paper was still in his pocket. His hand was shaking, but he held it steady. Inside, his heart was beating with a force he hadn't felt since the war. A mixture of fear, hope, and pent-up pain. Michael took 2 steps forward. The crowd around him slowly grew quiet. Even their cell phones went down. It was as if everyone knew, even if they didn't understand, that something much bigger than a sporting event was about to happen there. Those sneakers. "Where did you get them?" Jordan asked, his voice lower than usual. Bob took a deep breath. His eyes were watery, but he didn't shed a single tear. He was one of those people who held on to everything until the end. From a boy, many years ago. He got lost during a military parade. He was alone, crying, and I stayed with him until his father arrived. He gave me this pair as a thank you. He said he wanted to be a basketball player. Jordan didn't answer, but his eyes were already red. He took off his cap and looked around as if seeking confirmation in the silence. He touched his arms, as if his body couldn't believe what it was hearing. I was that kid. The sentence came out firmly, without hesitation, and the impact was immediate. The gym employee took a step back. A lady nearby put her hand over her mouth. A cameraman put down his equipment and just watched. Jordan took off his sneakers. He stopped. He took a deep breath. Then he knelt down in front of Bob and placed the new pair in the aged hands of the man who had been forgotten for so many years. You taught me how to breathe, how to not be afraid. You taught me how to wait in silence when everything seemed scary. I became who I am because of you. Tears fell from both of them. Bob, for the first time in a long time, cried in public without hiding it, without shame. Because that moment wasn't about pain. It was about restored dignity. Michael turned to the audience and raised his voice. This man saved me, and no one ever asked me who he was. The gym exploded into silence. A different silence. Deep, respectful. The young people who had laughed before were now motionless. Some with their eyes full. Others trying to understand why their chests hurt in a new way. A reporter's camera captured the exact moment Michael helped Bob sit next to him, on the side of the court, in the space reserved for legends. And there, finally, Bob was not a spectator. It was part of history. Comment here. Every promise has a right time to be fulfilled, because there are encounters that are never missed. They just wait for the right moment to change everything. The sound of applause seemed to come from far away, as if Bob were in a place apart, floating inside a reality he never believed he would see again. The warmth of the applause penetrated the thick walls that time had built around him. It seemed impossible that they were applauding him. Sitting there next to basketball's greatest living legend, Bob wasn't sure where to put his hands. His calloused fingers, used to holding rifles, fixing engines and holding back tears, now held a brand new pair of sneakers, given to him by the same hands that decades earlier he had helped wipe with a tissue as the boy cried, frightened, on a curb. Michael stood by her side, not as a celebrity, but as a man facing another man who had changed the course of his life. The two exchanged few words. But there, in that space between what was said and what was felt, there was something stronger than any speech. There was gratitude. There was reparation. Jordan asked for the microphone. The organizers hesitated. It wasn't on the schedule, but no one dared say no. When he took the microphone, he didn't pose. He didn't raise his voice. He just turned to the crowd and said, "You know, I've been recognized my whole life, for my talent, for my name, for the points I've scored. But before that, there was a day when I was just a scared boy." He looked back at Bob. The silence was absolute. I had lost myself, and this man stayed with me. He taught me to breathe, to wait, to trust that fear will pass. He didn't lecture me. He gave me presence. And that, my friends, that is worth more than any trophy. Someone cried in the stands. A lady put her hand to her chest. A little boy pointed at Bob and asked his mother, "Is he famous?" The mother simply replied, "Now it is." Bob lowered his head, not out of shame, but because after so many years of being invisible, it was as if this moment illuminated everything that had come before. All the times he had swallowed hard, all the nights he had spent in silence, all the looks that had been pretended not to see. But now, they saw. And when Jordan reached out to help him up, Bob hesitated for just a second. Then, with effort, he got to his feet. The applause started again. Louder, more emotional. This time, not for number 23, but for the man no one knew, but who had been there all along. The organization improvised a bench next to the court. Jordan pulled it towards Bob, and there the two sat, side by side, as if time had waited for this reunion for decades. Photographers ran, reporters whispered, but at that moment, Bob didn't care. Because what really mattered was that boy, now a man, by his side, looking at him with the same respect he had so many years ago. The old sneakers he was wearing now rested on his knees, like a relic, and, deep down, they were. Not because of their market value, but because of what they symbolized. A bridge between two lives, two worlds, two times that had finally met. And as the game resumed, with players trying to concentrate, their eyes still wet, Bob looked around. He was no longer the stranger in the corner. He was the center of a story that would never be forgotten. Because sometimes all a hero needs is to be remembered. And when that happens, the impact goes far beyond the court. That morning, Bob's house looked different. The sunlight came in differently through the living room window, as if even the sky knew the weather had changed. The phone was ringing nonstop. Neighbors who had never said more than good morning now wanted to shake his hand. Journalists knocked on the door, wanting details, wanting to know what it was like to be forgotten. And then, suddenly, remembered. Bob answered calmly, without rushing, as if he finally understood the value of the silence he had maintained for so many years. He did not position himself as a hero. He never had, and perhaps that was why he was now recognized in such a genuine way. The walls that once held dusty photos of battles, forgotten diplomas, and rusty medals now had something new. A glass frame with the sneakers that changed everything. The old ones, worn and dirty, next to the new ones, still with the fresh signature, like a bridge between past and present. But it wasn't the sneakers that made him smile every time he looked at that frame. It was what they represented. Not a moment of fame, but the end of a long wait for something that can't be bought. Dignity. Bob walked around the house with lighter steps. His knee still hurt, of course. His body still bore the marks of a hard life. But his chest was at peace. For the first time in a long time. Outside, a group of young people from the community organized a simple tribute. Signs with phrases like, "Thank you for serving," and "You are our hero," were hung in the park where Bob used to walk with his grandson. A few kids, the same ones who had laughed at him days ago, were now there, holding signs with shame in their eyes and respect in their hands. Bob appeared, as always, wearing his brown jacket and military cap. But something about him was different. It wasn't just the way he walked. It was the way he looked. A look that was now greeted with waves, with sincere smiles, with hugs from strangers who suddenly felt like they knew him. During the small ceremony, the local school principal approached and extended an invitation for Bob to tell his story to the students. Not the story of Michael Jordan, but the one that came before. The story of the hard days. The pain that no one sees. The decisions that shape character. Bob thought for a moment. He never liked to put himself out there. But there was something about the request that seemed bigger than him. Accepted. And the following week, sitting in front of a room full of restless teenagers, he began with a simple sentence. "One day, I was invisible to everyone. But that didn't stop me from doing what was right." The silence was immediate. There, at that moment, Bob understood that his mission was not over yet. That his journey was now different. To inspire. To teach. To be the bridge between generations that have forgotten how to listen. And, as he spoke, a boy in the back of the room drew something in his notebook. When class ended, he came over and showed the drawing. A pair of sneakers. One old, one new, and a sentence at the top. "Every journey leaves marks. Some we don't see, but we feel them forever." Bob smiled. He touched the boy's shoulder. "Thank you. That's exactly it. Because when the truth comes out, it doesn't scream. It transforms." And what Bob Gaines discovered is that the world may take its time, but an upright heart will always be recognized in due time. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way. And maybe, just like Bob, you're also carrying something that the world hasn't seen yet, but that deserves to be remembered. If this content made sense to you, if at any point you felt part of this journey, leave a comment below with the phrase, "I value what no one sees." Oh, that way, I'll know you stayed with me until the end. Take advantage and leave a like, not only because it helps the channel, but because it shows that there is still room for stories like this, full of truth, memory, and transformation. And if this video brought you something good, imagine what comes next. There is content here that complements this topic and will take you even deeper into this journey. Click there and continue with me for another chapter of this journey.